Kurt Thompson, your 2020 president of the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. And here with me is our CEO, Teresa Hatton.
Good morning, everyone.
I want to thank you for joining us for the first of our three-part series, Fair Housing and Diversity in Real Estate. And thank you for attending. We're at a very special moment in history, a moment where we're embracing difficult conversations, evaluating where we are, where we have been, and where we want to go. Real estate agents are fortunate, and realtors in particular, to be able to help so many people realize their dreams of homeownership, and through homeownership, create the catalyst to positively impact economics, health, and educational opportunities for generations to come. Yet the real estate industry also has a darker history that we must come to grips with. One that through practices like redlining, blockbusting, and deed restrictions has systematically denied the opportunity for homeownership to many Americans. Even today, we continue to struggle with the effects of policies and laws that have largely worked to keep us apart and not bring us together. Most recently, we were compelled to engage the systematic discrimination still present in our industry and the challenges that were uncovered by the Newsday investigation in New York and the Suffolk law study in Boston. That said, I have faith in our realtors to drive positive change in our industry and continue to strive towards our highest ideals. We subscribe to a higher code of ethics and work so hard towards inclusivity and championing fair housing laws. Through continued education and awareness, we can continue the progress and bring our industry and our communities closer to the ideals that we strive for. So let's begin that journey today. With me, we are joined by Jamie Langowski, Assistant Director of Housing Discrimination Testing Program, and Catherine LaRaia, Director of Investigations and Outreach at Housing Discrimination Testing Program. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So I'll just launch right into it. As Kurt said, my name is Jamie Langowski. My co-presenter is Catherine LaRaia. We both use she, her pronouns, and we're both attorneys that work for the Housing Discrimination Testing Program at Suffolk. We're really excited for this opportunity to present to you about fair housing today. And we want to thank the association for reaching out and setting this up. The work that you do in helping people find homes is incredibly important and life-changing for people. And we appreciate the opportunity to help give you the tools that you need to do that important job. So first, a little housekeeping. Our program is funded by grants from HUD. This presentation does not necessarily reflect HUD's views. The training was planned in coordination with the Mass Association of Realtors. It hasn't been approved to fulfill requirements of any mandated fair housing training, and this presentation is not intended to provide legal advice. The association, they asked us to give a historical perspective related to housing rights. So what we're going to do is give an overview of housing exclusion and then rights over our history, and then briefly discuss the landscape today. After that, we're going to discuss implicit bias and how that can impact our work, and then we're going to follow up with a Q&A. So as Kurt said, with history, I think starting the conversation with a look at history is really important, because what housing looks like today is the result of hundreds of years of laws, policies, practices. We have a very segregated society, and that segregation did not happen organically. We have not always had equal housing, equal rights in housing in the US, and a look at history shows that from our very beginning, we purposefully excluded people. So I'm going to start way back. The starting point for slavery in the United States is considered to be 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. The true number of people who were forced into slavery isn't known, but some estimate that 6 or 7 million people were. The kidnapping and enslaving of people from Africa was outlawed in 1808, but slavery actually legally continued in the United States until 1865. It was in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and that gave people who were enslaved in the rebel states their freedom. And it was in 1865 that the 13th Amendment was added to the US Constitution, and that mandated an end to slavery throughout the United States. So race-based discrimination in housing has actually been illegal since 1866, when the Civil Rights Act of that year was passed. Although I do want to note that that law specifically excluded Native Americans, even though it outlawed race-based discrimination. After that law was passed, discrimination based on race and other factors continued, though, for many, many years. And it was enforced by or encouraged by the government at all levels. In the 1890s, jurisdictions known as sundown towns came into existence throughout the entire country. The name describes the practice, and what these places did was basically they did not allow Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be within the city limits or sometimes the county limits after sundown, which meant people could work in these areas, but they could not live there. And sundown towns were all over the United States, places like Richland, Washington, Boulder City, Nevada, Greendale, Wisconsin, Stamford, Connecticut. Many places that became sundown towns already had residents of color when the policies were adopted. And many people who lived there were violently thrown out of their homes by mobs and riots of white people. This practice started in the 1890s, and you'll see on this timeline, I don't have an end date because a look at the census data, the current census data, in many places show that the policies and practices that happened, the effects are still present today. So then in the early 1900s, exclusionary zoning laws were used by local governments to prevent people based on race and ethnicity from moving into upper and middle class neighborhoods and to segregate people. The Supreme Court then outlawed that practice in 1917, finding those laws to be in violation of the 14th Amendment. It's the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that gives us equal protection under the laws. So after exclusionary zoning laws, another discriminatory policy that came along was restricted covenants in the 1920s. I do have an end date there for when this practice was outlawed. However, like sundown towns, you can still see the effects, and there are still documents that have that discriminatory, albeit unenforceable, language in existence today. In those documents, as many of you probably know, they put restrictions based on who a homeowner could sell to based on race. The 1930s brought Roosevelt's New Deal, and one aspect of that program was more accessible home loans. GIs were coming home from war. They couldn't afford to buy their own homes without help. And so the Federal Housing Administration's own underwriting manual and influence over mortgages encouraged redlining, which, as you probably, many of you know about redlining, but I'm just going to say the definition: the discriminatory practice of refusing to offer mortgages or equal terms in particular communities based on the demographics of the residents of that area. So if you compare redlining maps from decades ago to more current census data maps, you can see that the effects of the federal government's policies are still being felt today. The map on the right-hand side is 2010 census data. It's a dot matrix map where one dot represents one person. And the color blue represents white people, teal representing Black people, red represents Asian people, and orange represents Latinx people. And as you can see, and this is, you probably figured out the Boston area in their similar areas of the map, you can see how segregated that the area still is in 2010 when you look at it in this way. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and then amended in 1988, outlawed redlining and other discriminatory practices based on 7 protected classes. And you probably know from going through classes to do your work, the term protected class, it's a legal term. It identifies characteristics that can't be the basis for certain discriminatory actions. And the Fair Housing Act makes it illegal to refuse to rent, sell, negotiate with someone based on their race, the color of their skin, whether they have children, their national origin, their religion, disability, or their sex. The act also makes it illegal to set different terms or conditions, provide different facilities, give false information, engage in blockbusting, denying access to services such as MLS, to make, print, or publish any notice, statement, or advertisement that indicates a preference or gives a limitation based on protected class, or to impede someone's exercise of their fair housing rights. So that was like a whirlwind of history that covered in very little time, hundreds of years, related to exclusion from and then rights related to housing. The history, though, is important because it has led us to where we're at today. And as you know, home ownership means the generational building of wealth. It's one of the reasons why it's so incredibly important for people. A recent study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston shows the incredible gap that exists by race when you look at net worth. So in 2015, white people had a net worth of $247,500 on average. This is not a typo. Black people had a net worth of $8. And Dominicans in our area, in the Boston area, had a net worth of close to $0. And here's the study from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. It was done in 2015. And it's estimates of US-born people in the Boston metropolitan statistical area. Hundreds of years of policies and laws that excluded people from housing have had a lasting impact. And you can see it in studies like this that show net worth census data that shows how segregated our nation is, and in what we see in the rental market today. Our segregated society didn't happen organically. It is the result of hundreds of years of policies, practices, laws. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Catherine LaRaia, to talk about the research study that our program recently conducted, and it further illustrates what the rental market is like today.
Thank you, Jamie. The Housing Discrimination Testing Program, or HDTP, conducted an investigation into the levels of race and voucher discrimination in Greater Boston area from August 2018 to July 2019. In Massachusetts, it's illegal to discriminate against source of income. And by source of income, we mean, Section 8, housing subsidies. Although these are federal programs, they're not a protected class federally, but in Massachusetts they are. And race, of course, it's illegal to discriminate against race under Massachusetts law and federal law as well. In our routine enforcement testing, we do see both kinds of discrimination, but one of the highest groups of types of discrimination that we find is in source of income. Knowing that racism is such a problem in our nation and in our state, and seeing how segregated Boston is, we began to suspect there was something going on there, because clearly there are higher rates of racial discrimination that's going on, and we're just not testing it. Instead, we're seeing source of income discrimination. We suspected that people were discriminating against source of income as a proxy for race. Now, the majority of voucher holders in Massachusetts are white women, but we know that people hold certain prejudices and assumptions about voucher holders. We suspected that people were more comfortable saying, we can't rent to you because of your voucher, than saying, we can't rent to you because of your race. So we developed testing methodology to pull apart these two variables, race and source of income, to see and unpack really what was going on. In order to assess whether discrimination was happening and against whom, we would have to send Black and white testers to the same apartment to compare their experience. By the same token, we would need to send voucher holders and non-voucher holders or market rate applicants to the same apartment. By collaborating with Analysis Group, which is an international economic statistics firm, we determined that we would need to test 50 test sites to generate statistically significant data. Therefore, we would need to send 4 testers to 50 units. We then recruited and trained 200 individual testers for the study. As you can see the breakdown, 100 of those testers were white, and of the 100 white, 50 were assigned vouchers and 50 were market rate. The other 100 were Black, with 50 of those testers voucher holders and 50 market rate. So 1 Black market rate, 1 white market rate, 1 white voucher holder, and 1 Black voucher holder would all go to the same apartment. They would contact the advertisement, they would try to tour the apartment, and they'd write the report about their experience. Then HDTP and analysis group would compare the 4 tester reports for each of the 50 tests and assess what patterns of treatments emerged, both in the individual test and across all 50. Each tester was given a profile that included the basic information that we can expect to be exchanged during an apartment hunt. And all 4 testers in a single test, they were all the same sex. They were all assigned similarly good credit scores and similarly good rental histories. All of them were employed. And testers were assigned names that indicated their race based on prior academic research. So names such as Ebony, Jamal, Aisha were assigned to Black testers, and names like Brad and Jill and Meredith were assigned to white testers. Testers were trained to introduce themselves with their assigned name during every interaction with housing providers. And all the housing providers were in the greater Boston area, and the units were either accessible by train or bus. And the reason we looked at greater Boston was really just a logistical reason. That's where we're housed, that's where our testers are. But I don't think that our results can be isolated to Boston. I think it's fair to say what we uncovered can be extrapolated to Worcester, to Springfield, and beyond. Now, all the units were in the same voucher price payment standards. So they were all affordable to testers, whether they had vouchers or whether they were market rate. What we did, we provided the price, the size, and the geographical limits to analysis group, and they in turn pulled advertisements and randomized them, providing that list to us every week to go through. Other protected classes, such as families with children, that was not introduced. Everyone was single, and all the testers were looking for a 1-bedroom or a studio unit. All the testers presented as cisgendered, had no visible disabilities, and did not have an accent which could perhaps be indicative that they were not born in the US. With these parameters in place, we plan to simulate what a real housing search would look like for somebody in each of our 4 categories. Each tester contacted the person listed in the advertisement, what we call a housing provider. And in the vast majority of cases, this was either a real estate agent or a person associated with a real estate agent or agency. Each tester expressed interest in the unit. Each tester over the phone introduced their race indicating name or their voucher. And then we ended the test at the application stage. So nobody applied for an apartment. It was always leading up to the tour, requesting an application, and then the test ended. Collectively, these 200 testers gathered evidence about what information was given, what information was asked of them, and whether they were able to make an appointment and ultimately tour the unit. Now, before I share the actual results of what we found, I just want to acknowledge that this is very difficult to hear. This is real. This is evidence of discrimination that happened to real people based on their race and their source of income. Obviously, many people know that this is what the reality is in our market, but it's important to quantify what's happening and acknowledge that it is difficult to hear. 86% of the voucher holders experienced discrimination, and 71% of our Black testers were discriminated against. All the testers were working. They had good credit. They could afford the unit. Unfortunately, many were screened out before they could even demonstrate their ability to rent. While some instances, unfortunately, were overt and explicit, the majority of cases we saw what's called discrimination with a smile. The individual did not know they were given different treatment or different information than other prospective tenants. The individual had no reason to suspect discrimination. But when we compared the data in the aggregate, we saw common trends. The voucher holders and the Black testers were more often ghosted. That is, the housing provider just stopped responding to their calls after their protected class status was introduced. Black testers and voucher holders were more often asked about their credit scores, their ability to pay, based on simply the fact of their race or their source of income. And Black testers and voucher holders were also much less likely to be able to ultimately secure an appointment to tour the unit. So in the next following slides, I'm going to be pulling apart each of these sort of categories of data that we found. So ghosting, as we said, ghosting is when a tester would introduce their race by name during a phone call to the housing provider, or introduce their voucher, which they were instructed to mention in the phone call early on in the conversation. And once either or both of those variables were mentioned, their experiences really diverged from what happened to the white testers. It was common for housing providers to simply end the call, promising to call back or test, rush the tester off the phone, and too often all communication just ceased right there, despite the tester continuing to call, to reach out, to leave messages. Once a voucher holder introduced their voucher, they were ghosted 42% of the time. This only happened to 10% of the white market rate vouchers, and the white market rate testers. Now, some of the black and white voucher holders were expressly told, oh, you have a voucher, that's fine, it's not a problem, we can work with that. But 56% of those testers were eventually ghosted. And 81% of the testers who were told your voucher is not a problem, we found ultimately discrimination of source of income in 81% of those tests. We also saw significant differences in which testers were able to actually tour the unit. Now remember, they were all assigned similar characteristics. All were able to afford the rent. All had no financial red flags. 80% of our white market rate testers were able to see the unit. Less than half that, 48% of the black market rate testers received tours. And black and white voucher holders were only able to tour the unit between 18 and 12% of the time. To put this another way, a white market rate person could call 10 listings and expect to tour 8 of those units. A black market rate tester would only be able to see roughly half the apartments they called about. And if the applicant has a voucher, no matter the race, if the applicant has a voucher, they'd have to call 10 ads to be able to see 1. Put even more simply, housing providers just don't call back Tyrone and Ebony. And if Emily has a voucher, they're not going to call her back either. But Brad and Jill and Meredith, they got tours, they got follow through. A similar trend we found is that if you're a white market rate caller, you're told about more units than the one you're simply asked about. Again, this is a difference in the levels of customer service. This is discrimination with a smile. White market rate testers were told about 1.35 available units. Now, how does that make sense? If you call and ask about a unit, how are you told about 1 and 35% of a unit? That means that the white testers were sometimes offered additional units, something above and beyond what they were calling about. 1.35 is a lot more than the 0.63 units that black market rate testers were told about. And black and white voucher holders were only told between 0.2 and 0.26 units were available. If this were random, we'd expect to see all the numbers really closer to 1, with the understanding that sometimes units rent before the tester calls, and the rental market is really fast moving. But unfortunately, these rates indicate this isn't random. They indicate a trend. I've shared a quote here from one tester's report. So this is what she recorded as her recollection of what happened during the tour. Now, this woman, we called her Meredith, and Meredith was a white market rate tester, and she toured the unit. And afterwards, the housing provider invited her to join a select group of people who were going to tour another unit. He told her, we don't advertise that apartment because then we would have to respond to everyone who inquires. We're just looking for people with quiet lifestyles who work, not CEOs necessarily, but just people with good jobs. The white voucher holder and the 2 black testers, they never heard anything about this select group or this secret apartment. Again, this plays out in the number of units actually shown to testers. As we said earlier, white market rate testers were told upfront about more available units than other testers. Those white market rate testers were ultimately able to see more units as well. So white market rate testers saw 1.14 units. Again, less than half that. Black market rates only saw 0.54. And white and black voucher holders only between 0.12 and 0.24 units. Again, in an ideal world, this would all be closer to 1, but we see stark differences between the groups of testers. And tellingly, in all 50 of the tests, only 10 white market rate testers, only 10 were unable to see an apartment. And they weren't ghosted. 5 of those 10 were actually called, apologized to, and told, I'm sorry, the unit rented. We tracked the type of housing providers while we were conducting this study in 3 groups, simply real estate professional, property owner, or property management. We did not break down real estate professionals into brokers or people operating under other brokers' licenses and so forth. And that would be very interesting to know and worthy of looking into further. But 14 testers interacted with a property owner and 4 interacted with property management and 187 interacted with a real estate professional. And just by the way, that adds up to more than 200 because some testers interacted with other people. They would be on the phone with the broker, and then the broker and the owner would show up at the tour, for example. But clearly, what we're finding, these rates are connected to real estate professionals. And we have to look at what's going on here. We understand that professionals are in a difficult position. We absolutely do. Real estate professionals are providing professional service to owners who may be packing their own prejudicial views and expectations into their interaction with the real estate market. Real estate professionals are providing a service. We know that real estate agents are trying to abide by the law. We know. We exonerate real estate agents every day in our routine testing. We understand. But that they are in a hard place trying to satisfy clients who may hold discriminatory beliefs. And we appreciate and know that the voucher system has requirements that a lot of owners don't want to have the delay or even the inspections that go hand in hand with putting a voucher holder into an apartment. It's a difficult balance. And our research, we only looked at the what. We never looked at the why, what's really going on. We just gathered the data, put some numbers on it. But we do believe our study indicates some level of implicit bias is going on. And we can assume that real estate professionals, like lawyers, like doctors, we all have some level of implicit bias. As we're all in some form of industry, service industry, and where our actions are all dictated by law, it is especially important to be aware of the risks that implicit bias play for us. In our next segment, Jamie's going to discuss how implicit bias operates and ways that we can make ourselves more aware of our biases.
Thanks, Catherine. So like Catherine said, professionals have biases. I mean, really all people do. And so I want to focus in for our remaining time on implicit bias. Our study, as Catherine said, wasn't designed to determine why discrimination was happening, just to measure the level. And I think that maybe a lot of the discrimination that we uncovered might be due to implicit biases. So to start from the beginning, and I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but it's really good to make sure that you're thinking about this a lot. Bias is a prejudice in favor of or against a person, a group, a thing, usually in a way considered to be unfair and in favor of another person, group, or thing. There's explicit biases and there's implicit biases. So with explicit bias, we're aware of those feelings. They happen consciously. With implicit bias, we're talking about our subconscious and one of the ways that our brains are helping us out. They're really giving us a hand. Our brains process information for us constantly, and we don't even think about it or realize what's going on. The temperature of the room, the airflow, movement around us, we're bombarded with information constantly that if we had to stop and manually process everything that was happening, we wouldn't be able to get much done. So some stuff happens almost automatically, or it feels like it. Think about the act of reading. For many people, once you've learned to read, when you see letters on a page, it's difficult to look at that group and not immediately translate it into words. Our brains take care of that for us. Some things we need to spend more mental energy on to process, like complex math. Most of us don't just look at an equation and see the answer like we read words on a page. So I want to give you some illustrations of this. You see 3 columns on this slide. The far left has red, orange, blue, yellow, green written on it. Most people's brains will immediately translate those words written into what they say with very little mental effort. In the middle column, the words are written in the color that the words represent, the same association. So green is written in the color green. Those two things go together. So it is very easy, again, for most people's brains to make that connection with very little mental effort. The column on the right-hand side is a little trickier. If you were asked to state out loud the color, but not the word that you see, most people will have to slow down, even a little bit, maybe a lot, just to be able to say that color instead of the word that you're seeing. You're going to actually spend a little more mental energy to separate the color from the word and say it in the correct order. This is because our brains are making that connection between the word and the color for us. They're helping us out. So what I'm talking about with mental effort, it's actually energy that's being spent by your body. There's actually a perceptible difference in how you feel when you're thinking harder. Here's another example. Think to yourself, what is happening here? If we were in person, not so many people, I would have people shout it out or put it in chat or whatever, but here, just think to yourself, what's happening? You know, you can probably come up with a guess pretty quickly without knowing any other details about what you see. I think this kid doesn't want to eat whatever that food is on the tray. Your brain takes your own life experiences and helps you make a guess or an assumption about what you see. So I look at this and I immediately think this kid is a girl because of some visual clues. I think unhappy from the look on their face. Very little mental effort went into that assessment and those assumptions on my part, whether they're correct or not. So now real quick, without a calculator, what's the answer? 17 times 24. I'm gonna let it sit, see if you actually try to do it. So the answer is 408. You may have felt an actual difference in your body if you actually took the time to try to tackle those two different types of questions. Different parts of your brain are needed to engage in order to answer. The side of your brain that engages in system 1 thinking, it's quick, it's automatic, it jumps to conclusions. This is where implicit bias happens. System 2 needs to be engaged for more complex tasks, things that take more mental effort. It's the part of the brain that'll take over when it's realized that system 1 needs help. So we're gonna watch a 2.5-minute video next that the New York Times made about implicit bias. I think it's it does a really good job of summing up what we are talking about. I'm sorry if it's laggy. I'll find out from somebody and just cancel it if it's not working, but bear with us.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it. But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that go with judgments you might not agree with. Sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist. The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism. But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit. Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We've never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent, aggressive, and not to be trusted. They're criminals, they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not yourself. We're biased.
All right, so what can we do? We each have a lifetime of influences and learning that is impacting how we think and how we behave. Research has not uncovered some magical way to erase implicit bias, but there are some strategies for reducing the impact it has on our decision-making and our actions. So education about implicit bias really has been found to help. Education like this, talking about it, learning, thinking. And self-assessment also helps. You can't just think about what are my implicit biases because they're implicit. They're basically hidden from us. So Project Implicit has developed free, they're quick, usually take about 10 minutes. They can be anonymous tests that are designed to identify biases. They have a lot of tests on their website that range from age to gender identity, skin color. It's a really interesting process, and I recommend taking a test or two or even more repeatedly too, because you can see over time when you take them whether or not biases have shifted for yourself. They also cover the readings. There's readings on their website about the science behind it. It is really an eye-opening experience, and I recommend taking them. Another thing that can really help fight implicit bias is developing processes to use. Things like checklists, and that has happened in the medical field, where matters related to implicit bias can mean life or death for people. Things like checklists can help ensure that everyone is being treated equally, or that you're taking the same actions for every client. And it can take that part of your brain that is helping you out with shortcuts, it can take it out of the equation. And that leads to the final tip, slowing down. Whenever you can slow down in the process that's happening and think about your thinking, it will help move you from that system 1 area where implicit bias happens to system 2 when it's needed. So let's see, I've got one more video here.
When I graduated law school, I had my first big case across the river in Madison County, Illinois, and I was a king. I couldn't lose. I won every motion, every hearing, and we came into trial with a stacked deck. I felt pretty good about my job choice. So my second case, which was in Jackson County, Missouri, over in Kansas City, I went from king to pauper. I couldn't win anything. I couldn't win a hearing. I couldn't win what day of the week to start the trial on. The only thing I won in that case was a parking ticket I got while I was stuck in court. But this awoke the engineer in me. How was it possible to change the outcome of a case just by changing the location? I mean, these were two similar cases. My facts were similar. My legal arguments were just as good, but the outcomes were completely different based on location, or the judge changed, or the parties changed. I wondered if there was truly institutional bias, or if I was going crazy. So I began to dig deeper. I found I wasn't crazy. In Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston is, plaintiffs, people who bring a lawsuit, have a 25% chance of winning on average. Here in St. Louis, it's 57%. Again, average across all cases, all case types. I went deeper and found that 80% of qualified Black jurors in certain counties in Alabama are rejected from jury duty despite the fact that the Supreme Court has said rejection based solely on race is unconstitutional. Maybe most concerning was this graph. Has anybody ever seen this graph before? I mean, have any idea what it is? It's the probability of being granted parole. So as the day starts, you have a very high probability of being granted parole, and then it drops and drops. It spikes and drops and drops, and spikes and drops again as the day goes on. It's one day. Anybody know what the spikes are? Food breaks. So the likelihood of you being granted parole is not just dependent on the crime you committed or the behavior you've had since then, but it's fundamentally and directly correlated to the blood sugar level of your judge. What kind of legal system do we have when one of the best things you can bring into a courtroom isn't legal counsel, but a cupcake? And I want to be clear here. I'm not throwing stones, right? I'm a lawyer. I don't think I'm above the biases that the rest of the industry has been faced with. I don't think I'm immune to them. I don't think we all are. These are human biases. And I also want to be clear, I'm not saying that the law is broken. I'm saying that the humans who write the laws, who interpret the laws, who enforce laws, those humans have a fundamental bias that has a substantial effect on the outcome of a lawsuit. It can change guilt to innocence. It can change a multi-million-dollar verdict to a defense verdict. And it can change parole to another stint in prison. So when I was faced with all...
So I feel that that video illustrates the impact that our thinking can have that we may not be intending it to have. And I like to believe that I do believe that judges aren't making decisions based on knowingly making decisions based on being hungry or not, tired, that sort of thing, that doctors aren't doing the same sort of thing, that lawyers, that real estate agents aren't. But the evidence, the data shows that we do have factors that impact our thinking that we don't even realize is happening. So we just covered a lot of information in a really short amount of time. And I know you're going to be diving deeper with the association into some of these topics. So hopefully this set you up well for the later conversations. We wanted to provide a longer list of resources, and we can certainly provide more if anyone is ever interested. Here are just a few really good articles, books, podcasts that cover what we've talked about. Some we referenced in this talk. The first two on this slide are books that go much deeper into the racist laws and policies that our government has had, for hundreds of years. The video, Segregated by Design, listed here, it's an excellent, in short, it's about 17, 18 minutes. It's an excellent visual summary of that history. And then the NPR episode on here, I really recommend for people in our industry that work in housing to listen to. The first half is about HUD and the Fair Housing Act, and the second half actually follows some fair housing testers in New York City. If you want to read our full report or watch a webinar on it, it's available on the Boston Foundation's website. It's about an hour long, the webinar video. And then as Kurt referenced, Newsday did a fair housing investigation in the Long Island area that focused on home sales. And it's not behind a firewall or anything. Anyone can access that. It's really interesting. If you want to dive deeper on implicit bias, I just threw a few really good materials. There's a lot out there. But these were three that I really found helpful when I was digging deeper for myself. And I certainly implemented things in my classroom based on what I learned to make sure that I was taking out implicit bias in how I treat students. And then last, I'll just say at the very beginning, we introduced our pronouns. If you're wondering why people do that or want information on that, mypronouns.org is a really great resource. So with that, I don't know if you have any questions because I haven't been monitoring chat, but we're happy to take any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you again for such an incredible presentation with a lot of really good data to think about and digest, and most importantly, ponder and think about in the coming days and weeks as well. Justin and Catherine, I know that you've been monitoring the chat for questions from our viewers today. Could you share a couple of those questions with us?
Absolutely. First of all, Jamie, Catherine, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We do have a few questions that came in. A couple of them relate to agents being directed by landlords. Specifically, they want this type of tenant. Do you know of any resources available to agents that are in that position to help educate them as to how to deal with that situation so that they can work with that landlord?
Yeah, that's a really tough thing to have to deal with, and I think that happens a lot. I don't have any resources offhand sort of for that social interaction with people. I think really to arm oneself with the law. And I think that this happens in the legal field too. Lawyers are often invited by clients to join them in what they're doing that is not above the board. And clients want to feel like what they're doing is okay, and they'll ask their attorneys to, kind of help them hide what they did or something like that. And attorneys just have to remember their ethics training and just tell them. I go back to when I was a kid and I didn't want to do something, my own parents would be like, just blame us, tell your friends that they won't let you do it. It's the same thing in the legal field where we tell our clients, I'm sorry, but we're barred by ethics laws. I will lose my license to practice if I do this. And it's just, there's no easy way to deal with it because it is an incredibly, incredibly difficult spot to be in. And I think it's even harder for real estate agents because they're balancing both that homeowner, or whoever the landlord is, or the home seller, and they're balancing, the person that they're interacting with to rent or to buy. And so I think arming with the law is, I would say shutting it down as soon as it happens. I can't help you do that because that is illegal and it will expose me to a lawsuit. And the problem is real estate agents will be exposed even if the homeowner falls under some sort of exemption. There's no exemptions under the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is still in existence. There's no exemptions under the Fair Housing Act or under Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law 151B. There's no exemptions for real estate agents. You know, so I would be very careful with that. And I wish there was a better way to say it other than that. But I mean, I think addressing it right from the beginning, as soon as it comes up, you know, that's not something that as a professional, as a licensed professional, I can help you do.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thinking of yourself as an attorney and things that they work on. So really good answer there.
Yes.
A question about
Sorry
the
about
flip.
that. I wanted to add one thing to that as well, because this is something that realtors encounter all the time in the field. Courage, one word, courage. It does happen. You need to speak with your broker, and then you need to have the courage to have the conversation with your seller to help educate them as to what the law is. And if they're not willing to comply, you need to have the courage with your, again, having a conversation with your broker to potentially end that relationship with that consumer.
Thanks, Kurt. So the follow-up question to that came in is looking at it on the flip side. Can a landlord and an agent say, I only want to rent to a voucher holder?
That's an interesting question. I have to think about that because, I mean, obviously you couldn't say, I only want to rent to insert protected class, right? And voucher holders are a protected class, but you can't do it based on race. That's a really interesting question that I would have to do a little bit more legal research. You know, it's funny because I've had people ask me that about race, you know, specifically, can I only rent to Asian people? Like I want to help, you know, this community in particular. And that is illegal. You can't, you know, make a decision based on race. But with a voucher, I don't know. I'd have to look into that one. I'll reserve that. I'll take a look because that's actually a really interesting question. I mean, this is the problem when you work with attorneys. I mean, one, in this context, we can't give anyone legal advice, but there's always a caveat with things. And so we always like to do more research.
Yeah, Jamie, if that was an easy one, I wouldn't.
Yeah, right.
Have answered it beforehand. Let's see. Could you actually, this is good. Could you just repeat where members could find the implicit bias tests?
Yeah. So it's part of Project Implicit. If you Google Project Implicit, or if you Google Harvard IAT, which stands for Implicit Association Test, you will find their website. And it's cool because, like I said, you can take them anonymously. You can also log in. I never created an account, and I'll just be honest. Like I went into it thinking I don't have biases. I think I know how it's going to come out. But even me thinking that, I didn't want to create an account with my name and email and then have what I did saved somewhere that you know. And so you can take these tests anonymously. The information comes back. And with my first test, I got to say, I was like, I don't buy it. Like, because it didn't come out the way that I expected to with my explicit beliefs and biases. You know, it came out different. And so then I started thinking about it, and that's when I started diving deeper. But yeah, if you Google Harvard IAT Implicit Association Test, or it's called more specifically Project Implicit, you will find those tests.
Great. And going back to sort of taking directive, well, no, I don't want to. We're talking about the discrimination against source of income. And do you have any recommendations on working with HAPs? Because what we're hearing is some of the concern is that landlords and agents are having trouble getting a property inspected, and that could lead to, you know, months of a vacancy, and that they might be worried about that more than the source of income.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you brought that up because we recognize that. And certainly some of our testers, and Catherine, please feel free to jump in if you want, they were told by the people on the phone, you know, I will rent to you, but I don't want this to sit vacant, and I want to, you know, I'll rent to somebody faster if they come up, you know, and I get that mentality. I think that a recommendation would be to try, so first, at the stage where people are looking at apartments, treat everyone equally. come up with processes that can ensure that you're treating everyone the same. You're showing them the same number of units. I mean, and we understand some people have, I certainly do, some people have a bad day. You're going to act differently. You're going to treat people a little differently. You might not be feeling well and want to take people on a tour of the entire property on Tuesday, but you did all day on Saturday, right? Our study accounted for that and picked that sort of thing up. So we're still confident in what we found. So when it comes to that sort of thing, it's a legit concern from homeowners that there's going to be a delay. And we understand that the process isn't as streamlined as it could be. And that was one of our recommendations. And we're actually trying to work with HAPs to streamline those processes and come up with ways to do better customer service for both the voucher holder and the homeowner. I would say after the point where people have toured and everyone who's interested has been allowed to apply, I would say that's the point that you should reach out to their caseworker, you know, and say, look, how can we get you into this apartment on the move-in date? How can we get this inspection going? Like, work with the voucher holder in a way that they understand that they're welcome, that they're not unwelcome because of that voucher. Because if the statement is made up front before someone even gets to tour, I'm not going to rent to you because of this process. You know, it's no offense. And a lot of people apologize and they say, I'm sorry, no offense. I mean, that's the thing about, well, and that's one of the dangers and why we wanted to talk about implicit bias. The law does not differentiate between explicit bias and implicit bias. The behavior is the behavior. And so if it's a discriminatory action, people are still going to be liable. And so I would say, as you can, like, allow everyone interested to either apply or self-select themselves out. And then from there, if it is a person who has a voucher who is interested in applying, see if you can't work with their caseworker to get the process moving in a good fashion. I guarantee you, HAPs want their voucher holders in as soon as possible because those folks are on a time limit. You know, they've got to find housing before that time limit expires or they're going to risk losing their voucher. And part of what we were concerned about with what we found and what Catherine said was that folks had to look at 10 ads to see one apartment. That greatly extends the amount of time that it takes for someone. So I think that if the HAP will be, if it's not a barrier thrown up to the person with the voucher that you need to talk to their caseworker, that they have to do this, you know, that's the way to go about it. But offer that in order to help speed the process along and make sure that make sure that the person with the voucher knows that they're welcome to rent there. That's where I would start.
Great, and I'm sorry, we use acronyms all the time. Can you go over what an HAP is?
Yeah. So it's basically a voucher. It's a voucher issuing agency. So those range from housing authorities to quasi-governmental agencies. I mean, you'll have everything like Metro Boston to Boston Housing Authority. And it is important for people to remember, say you're out in Worcester and someone with a voucher from Boston Housing Authority approaches you, it works anywhere. So, you know, it's not like, oh, this is only good in Boston. So when you're approached with a voucher, pause, move your thinking to system 2 if need be, and think about, you know, I'm going to go through the exact same process. Like at the point when someone's asking for a tour, at the point when they ask for an application, there's no difference. Let the process figure itself out. The process that everyone gets equally, let that figure out who's going to be, because everyone wants the same thing. They want a good tenant. They want someone who's going to pay the rent, right? Take good care of the property, be a good neighbor to others. I mean, that's what they're looking for. So trust in the process that you've set up for screening people, and don't take shortcuts and screen people out early just because you're thinking, oh, voucher, this is going to slow it down. It's going to be a problem. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Another question, and Catherine Taylor, I know we get this one on the hotline, but is a landlord obligated to fix issues at a property if the Section 8 inspection flags things? And you can also punt this one because we are doing a Section 8 webinar in a few weeks, but it's one that's popped up.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, because it's fantastic you're doing a webinar, because it's a complicated process. And I mean, you know, you all aren't the only thing you're not focused on is fair housing, right? There's so many things that homeowners, real estate agents, people working with real estate agents have to think about. And so as far as the inspection, what people should keep in mind is the inspection isn't flagging little stuff. You know, they're not going to be like, oh, I think this carpet needs, you know, to be changed because it's a decade old. They're checking if it's up to code. And so this is stuff that you should probably know. I mean, you're getting a free inspection to make sure your unit is up to code. And, you know, you can take that to the homeowner and mention that to them. And so if something does come back, yeah, it's going to need to be fixed, because it's going to be things like there's not a lock on the door, or, you know, there's other major issues that bring the apartment out of code. So those inspections, I think the most frustrating thing for people that I hear is the it takes time in the process, but the inspection itself, I mean, it's actually a free look at making sure you're already in compliance with ordinances.
Okay, I think we have, I don't know, Kurt, Teresa, any final questions from you?
Well, I think the implicit bias is one that we're talking about quite a bit, and I know we'll be exploring that in about a week from now as well. You made some great suggestions in terms of resources. What have you found in terms of those that may have approached implicit bias and found ways to move through them in addition to systems and processes? What else have they done to really overcome implicit bias and change methodologies?
You mean individually for people, like to move that dial? So a few things that I didn't touch on that the research recommends is taking a look at our social groups and our professional groups, who we come into contact with. Are we very much just associated with our own in-groups? And if we are, then to make sure that you're taking the time to look for positive images and positive news articles about groups that are not in your in-group. Surrounding yourself with positive images. So the video mentioned that there's an over-association between Black men and violence. And so that's something that most people in American society have grown up with. And so to surround yourself with images of Black men that counter that. To note when there are surprises, like little moments where you're surprised by something that happens, to note that and kind of examine in yourself, why did this surprise me? I mean, that's another way to start to trigger those warning signs to yourself about implicit biases creeping in. I mean, it's hard because it's unconscious, you know?
Very true. Thank you. And any final thoughts, Jamie or Catherine, in terms of what you saw out there, or anything you'd want to make sure that our realtor members had heard or known?
I mean, I'll just say real quick, and then I'll let Catherine say something. But I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we recognize that that is the incredibly difficult position that real estate agents are in. And we know this from like what people that we work with, agents that tell us. And so navigating that and just, it's cool, Kurt, that you're talking about courage. And I think, I mean, I often just fall back on, I just can't, like, I follow the rules and I don't want to get in trouble. You know, I fall back on that all the time. But I mean, I think that it's important for agents to know, especially with studies like ours and the Newsday, that we know that there are many, many, many people out there who are trying so hard to treat everyone equally and trying so hard to get people into homes and do the right thing. We know it's hard. And so we do want to be a resource and help people however we can. Catherine, do you have any?
I just want to echo that, you know, we did this research not to point fingers or to shut doors, but to find a way to solutions. And we're just grateful to be invited here and to, you know, keep this conversation, this dialogue open, so that we can all work together to obviously address what nobody wants to see happen. You know, this is all our cities, these are all our states, these are all our communities, and we all want the best for them. So thank you, and I hope this is the first of many interactions.
Absolutely, and thank you for being here with us today. The first in a three-part series that we have. In the next week, we have Teresa. We have a wonderful program that's coming up on implicit bias and a panel discussion happening around the state. Would you like to tell them a little bit more about that, or I can always jump in also?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you, Kurt. And thank you, Jamie and Catherine and Justin and Kurt. Really excited for your introduction to implicit bias. Next week, we're having a psychologist, and he has his PhD in cognitive science, and he is going to share with us ways in which our minds work, exactly like you pointed out about the colors and the words, and different ways in which we can be more cognizant of our brain behavior, and give us some tips and tools about how to recognize it and how to perhaps start changing our habits in our brain so that we can make better choices sometimes. And I think slowing down, Jamie, the rental market is so hot, and the housing market is so hot that I think slowing down is, although difficult, a really excellent suggestion. So thank you for sharing that. So Ryan Winnett next week with a panel discussion of some of our realtor members from across the state, really talking about their experiences with bias towards them, things that they've witnessed, things that maybe they had happened to them themselves. So really just, let's just start talking about this, because if we don't, we can't make forward progress. So excited about that. Then the following week, we have a presentation on Section 8 and other housing subsidized programs, how they work, what it means, what the inspection process is like, what is the entire process from somebody finding out if they're eligible for these programs, and then how do they go out and successfully find housing, get the landlord set up. There's not a lot of education around these programs, and as Jamie pointed out, they have expiration dates, and it doesn't bode well for the housing agencies to constantly have to re-extend these vouchers. It kind of affects them negatively, like, hey, you're not doing your job, we're not really going to support you anymore. So it's a whole systemic cycle that we really need to learn more about to make sure that we can be most effective for all of the parties involved. So really excited for the next two in this 3-part series.
Perfect. Thank you, Teresa. And finally, I just want to say a huge thank you to you that are out there watching today. And I encourage you, this will be available later on. If recording, please do share it. These are some very, very important conversations that we're having. The National Association of Realtors and their leadership symposium this week had a lot of really tough, difficult, and very informative conversations that happened. And we're having a lot of those in Massachusetts as well. Get the information out, engage in the conversation. Let's talk about these, and let's find ways to be able to continue the progress that we've had and move the ball forward. Again, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you, Jamie and Catherine and Teresa, for your fantastic insight, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for the next segment.
Thank you.
Thank you.